We're just a few short days away from LSU taking the field in the Citrus Bowl against the Purdue Boilermakers. I didn't really know much about this team, and maybe you didn't either. So I consulted some help from a friend to learn what this game means for Purdue and what we can expect from LSU Citrus Bowl opponent on Monday. All of that and so much more on today's edition of Locked On LSU.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcast. Plus, you can find us on YouTube as well. Just search Locked On LSU in the search bar, hit that red subscribe button, and you'll get notified as soon as the podcasts drop. But of course, Locked On LSU, we are part of the Locked On Network, your team every day. My name is Caroline Fenton, and I am your host, as I am every day. I graduated from LSU. I've been covering LSU sports since 2016, and I'm now a sports talk radio host in Nashville, Tennessee. But let's get into it because we are just a few short days away from the final LSU football game of the season. LSU, the team now in Orlando, taking on Purdue in the Citrus Bowl on Monday. But I didn't know much about this team. I don't really know much about Big Ten teams outside of Michigan and Ohio State, and that's just because those are two of the top teams in the country. So I consulted the help from a friend, a Locked On friend, Nate Dickinson, the host of Locked On Big Ten, to get his insight of Purdue and this season and moving forward. And I thought one of the more interesting aspects of this game, at least for Purdue, is the head coach. We talk so much about every single team, LSU included, about players that they're not going to have, players that have opted out, and how this team could react differently to, could be anywhere from a quarterback to a safety to whatever it might be, that might not be a contributing factor in those games or have opted out of those games. But what we don't talk about, because that's not an issue for LSU, is how the loss of a head coach could affect this team. And Purdue is experiencing that now because the month-old news now, Jeff Brohm, Purdue's former head coach, has decided to take the job at Louisville. Now, Jeff Brohm's been at Purdue since 2017, so I can only imagine that every single player on this team, on this Purdue team, has played the entirety of their careers at Purdue, whether that's their entirety of their college career or however many years they've spent at Purdue has been under Jeff Brohm. He had a 36-34 record at Purdue. So how is this team going to respond to not having their head coach at the helm? Nate Dickinson of Locked On Big Ten joins the show now.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you have followed Jeff Brohm, he's a Louisville alum. So this was a really decision just of passion for him. I don't think it was him thinking Louisville's a better job necessarily. I've heard a lot of people saying since this has happened that he's actually leaving a better job in Purdue and what they have right now. Obviously, Louisville got rid of their coach, so it's a little bit of a difference from winning the Big Ten West to going to rebuilding a new program. But he played there. I don't think it's something where there's any sort of desire to get away from Purdue or anything like that. But he won't be there for the bowl game. I don't expect a whole lot of difference in what Purdue's going to do out there. I mean, they've got a month, so we'll see what ends up happening. And Brian Brohm, his brother, is going to take over the team and be the interim guy, at least for now, for this game. So we'll see what he ends up deciding to throw into the playbook. But ideally, I think Purdue wants to just kind of play its game here in January and see what it can do against an SEC football team.
Yeah, absolutely. And Purdue on the season, 8-5, first place in the Big Ten West. What has been Purdue's biggest strength so far this season?
They pass the football and kind of all over the field, down the field, mid-range, and even in the flats. They can get the ball to any different level. They pass the ball more often than most teams in college football. Aiden O'Connell is at a point where he's leading the Big Ten in a whole lot of numbers out there. I mean, Charlie Jones has more receiving yards than Marvin Harrison Jr. He has the same amount of touchdowns as Marvin Harrison Jr. on the season. So by the numbers, he's been the best receiver in the Big Ten. Payne Durham, their tight end, is perfect in red zone areas and just going and streaking across the middle when Charlie Jones is going deep. And then they've also brought in a guy like Devin Mockbee, a walk-on freshman running back who's been their leading ball carrier, but has also gotten involved more in the passing game, especially over the last month in this run where Purdue has gotten itself into that Big Ten title game. So when you have those kind of dynamic players at all three levels of your passing game, it really opened things up for O'Connell. And I think we saw it culminate in what was a really good game for him in the Big Ten championship game against Michigan. He put up numbers, but also he made some throws that I had not seen him make for a lot of the season. I would put that up against any other game he's had all year, that Big Ten title game.
And you mentioned his passing ability. How's the mobility there? Because I think we've seen LSU have a good bit of success against more of the mobile quarterbacks. What is his mobility like, or is he more kind of a pocket passer?
Well, that's when things start to unravel. When he gets under pressure, he's one of the least accurate quarterbacks in all the Big Ten. I think he hovers around 50% actually when he ends up getting under pressure. So it depends on him being able to have that time in the pocket. And that's one of those things I worry about when you're going up against a team like LSU on both sides of the football, going after the quarterback and also protecting the quarterback. And Big Ten has plenty of really, really big lines, but I mean, especially that LSU offensive line, which we may get to later on. I don't think there's that many that the Purdue Boilermakers have faced off against that are quite that big.
Yeah, no, there's a good bit of size on that offensive line. And the most astonishing thing is 2/5 of that offensive line are true freshmen. So I think that's one area that LSU fans are excited about in the future. Talk about the strengths. What has been Purdue's kind of bugaboo this season? What has been some of their biggest weaknesses that have cost them games?
It's on that defensive side of the ball. They don't really have something that stand out good on the defensive side as far as being able to stop teams. I mentioned, again, if they want to be able to stop the LSU run game, Big Ten has plenty of really good running backs. But it's the running backs themselves that is where the talent's at. LSU has such, again, a huge, strong offensive line out there. That battle in the trenches is what's really, really going to be interesting here, again, on both sides. But if I had to pick a weakness where it's a point where I'm really worried about it in this matchup specifically, it is in those trenches because it's an SEC offensive and defensive line are just a different kind of story, especially with what we've seen Purdue go up against so far this season. They've done well at times, but the times that they've really, really struggled and looked like they were just another one of the 5-6 teams in the battle for the Big Ten West, it was because they didn't have that kind of protection on the offensive side and ability to wreak havoc on the defensive side.
And coming up next, I want to get into what exactly does this game mean for Purdue. We'll get into that coming up next.
So imagine this. You are hanging out with some of your friends. You're putting back a few drinks. Maybe a few becomes a few too many. As the evening comes to an end and people start to head out, you think of calling for a ride. But then you're like, no, that's okay. I live nearby. I can make it home okay. It's no big deal. I'll just drive home. But what are the odds you'll get pulled over anyways? I mean, even so, what's the worst that could happen? Maybe your insurance goes up. Maybe you lose your license. You could lose your job. You could total your car. Or you could kill someone or yourself. Everybody knows the risks of driving drunk. The results are tragic and often deadly. However, that doesn't stop everyone from getting behind the wheel while under the influence. That's why police officers are out there right now looking for impaired drivers on our roads, and it's to save lives. So if you think that you're okay to drive after a few drinks, think again. It's New Year's Eve. There's going to be plenty of Ubers out. Just get a safe ride. Play it safe. Plan ahead. Get a ride. It only takes one mistake to change your life or someone else's forever. Drive sober or get pulled over. Well, thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts and on YouTube. But make sure to check out Locked On Sports Today. The biggest stories around the sports world in 20 minutes or less, plus instant reactions, game recaps, and Locked On's take of the day. Locked On Sports Today, available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Again, chat up with Nate Dickinson a few days ago about this Purdue and LSU matchup. Nate Dickinson, the host of Locked On Big Ten. And I wanted to learn about what this game really means for Purdue, because I think now it could differ for every team. Maybe some teams have a bunch of opt-outs and there's a lot of roster turnover. And maybe it's just, hey, let's just go out there, give it our all, give it the best we can do, and see what young guys that we can have that we can develop for next season. But for some programs, it's everything. For some programs, it's getting to that 10-win threshold, like LSU is facing against Purdue. For some programs, it's look, we had a really slow start to the season, had a second half of the season reach surgeons, and we want to finish off this season on a high note. I think we could experience that. The South Carolina Notre Dame games going on as I'm speaking. And I think that's kind of the case for those two programs. Slow start, resurgence late in the season. So what does this game mean for Purdue? Nate Dickinson gave me a little bit of an inside look.
Again, host of Locked On Big Ten, Nate Dickinson is joining us, and at least on the LSU side of things. They dropped that final regular season game, an embarrassing, devastating loss to Texas A&M. They get themselves kind of back up, take on Georgia in a really tough game in the SEC championship. Of course, drop that game to Georgia 50-30. I know, at least on the LSU side of things, we're going into this game thinking just don't end a really good season with a 3-game losing skid. At least go out of this season. Brian Kelly's first year, you beat Alabama, you beat Ole Miss, you beat Florida, you win the SEC West. At least go out of this game on a high note. For Purdue, what does this game mean?
For starters, it's one of the biggest games in recent memory for this program. This team had never played in a Big Ten championship game before last weekend. This team has not been a regular when it comes to bowl game appearances. I mean, playing after New Year's Day is a big deal for Purdue football. It also marks the end of an era. I mean, now Jeff Brohm's gone. Now you have yourself a lot of players on this team, especially a lot of really key players who aren't going to be a part of this team next season. And it marks for them the one culmination of everything they've worked for. They got to that Big Ten title game, and for just about every team in that Big Ten West, if you're not Iowa or Wisconsin, you've really never been to the title game, so you're pretty much, that's the goal. They did that. They pretty much knew they weren't going to have much of a shot unless things broke their way against Michigan, but now they're coming into a matchup where this is it. They've got a month to prepare. It's the last game that all these guys are going to be playing with each other. Jeff Brohm won't be there, but it will be a situation where that group, I feel like, has the collective, and I think when they run out onto that field, they're going to have that kind of emotion behind it of, hey, this is the last run out there for us. And for a team like LSU that's been fighting for a national championship in recent memory, I don't think that's something that the Tigers are going to be able to match. Whether it matters once things get out on the field, of course, we'll end up finding out. But for Purdue, this is more than just this season. It was the biggest game of the season when they beat IU. Then the Big Ten title game was the biggest game of the season. And now they're going to go ahead and have the time to prepare and get hyped up for what this will be, which is the biggest game of the season, and also maybe the biggest game for a lot of these guys that they'll play in a Purdue uniform.
Okay, whoa. I was shocked when I heard that this is the biggest game of the season, that this might even be the biggest game that some of the guys on the Purdue team has ever played in their collegiate career. I was shocked by this. One, considering Purdue just played in the Big Ten championship, but at least from the Purdue side of things, whether that's the fan base or within the walls of the football program, that they believe that this Citrus Bowl opportunity is bigger than that. And I look at it too, that's definitely not the case for LSU. I mean, I would argue that the SEC championship was a bigger stage and a bigger opportunity, a bigger game for LSU with a really difficult opponent. I would even argue that there are some regular season games that LSU has played so far this season that is bigger than the Citrus Bowl. And I don't mean to, totally discount the Citrus Bowl and say that this game doesn't matter. This game isn't big. A bowl game is a bowl game. An opportunity to get to 10 wins on the season is a huge opportunity. The opportunity to be able to wipe the slate clean of the last 2 losses that LSU has added to their schedule and be able to go out with a win, I think is an invaluable opportunity. However, I would argue Alabama LSU is a bigger game than LSU Purdue in the Citrus Bowl. I could even argue that maybe even Ole Miss LSU was a bigger game than the Citrus Bowl is, because it was such high stakes. And the Alabama game was a game that almost everyone across the country watched, and that's not going to be the case for the Citrus Bowl. So a couple thoughts on that. One is, I think that could potentially be a dangerous thing whenever you have one team coming in here and saying, hey, look, this is our Super Bowl. We saw it against Texas A&M. We knew Texas A&M wasn't going to be bowl eligible. So they treated this LSU game at the end of the season like it was their Super Bowl, like it was their Citrus Bowl, like it was for all the marbles. And they never gave up the fight. They never quit. Even when they had 4 wins on the season, they never stopped fighting in that game against LSU. So whenever you're going into this game with the mentality of this is the biggest stage I've ever been on, these are the highest stakes that I've ever played for on one sideline, and then the other sideline, it's, you know, and I don't know if this is the mentality or not. It shouldn't be. Is we've played in 3 or 4 bigger games so far this season, and this is just another game on our schedule. I think that could be a dangerous thing. Now, to that point, I don't think that's how this LSU team is approaching this game. I'll never forget there's a soundbite from a former Brian Kelly press conference, and he was talking about UAB. I believe it was the UAB post-game press conference, and he said that was a really big win for us. And maybe nobody else outside of the building, fans and commentators, so on and so forth, maybe nobody viewed it as such because it was LSU against, a group of 5 team in UAB. He said nobody else felt like this was a big game, but we did. And we had to approach it like that. We had to treat it like that. That it doesn't matter if it's UAB or if it's the University of Alabama. Wins are wins that you have to pick up, and you can't overlook these games. So that really stood out to me because I looked at that like Brian Kelly is getting these guys ready to play, no matter who it is. You treat UAB like it's a big game, then you respect it, and you won't look over those kind of cupcake kind of games that you see a loss in the schedule, and it's like, what? How'd you lose that game? Texas A&M and Marshall, for example. Not Marshall, excuse me. App State, Notre Dame, and Marshall. So I think that was a good thing. And I think the other thing that I really appreciated about that was if you view the UAB game like it's super important, like you view it like this is a big game, then the big games, the Alabamas, the Ole Misses, the Floridas, the Georgias in the SEC championships, those kind of games seem a lot less intimidating. So that's what I appreciated hearing from that. So even though, no, this isn't the biggest game that LSU has played this season. No, this isn't the biggest game that these players have played in their lives. I don't think that this is going to be a game that Brian Kelly overlooks. One, because they didn't overlook UAB. They have that mentality in that locker room. And I think, 2, I feel like I've mentioned it a couple times. I think that even though Brian Kelly says, we're not looking at 10 wins as being a successful season, I do think that there is a certain amount of looking at a 10-win season of that's like the line of demarcation of that was a successful season. And ending the season on a win rather than 3 consecutive losses, that's a big deal. It's a big deal. But coming up next, today's episode is brought to you by BetOnline. So let's give some picks. We've got some college football playoff games this weekend. I'll give you my picks for the weekend coming up next. On New Year's Eve, we've got Georgia, Ohio State, TCU, and Michigan. I'm a betting lady, so I'll give you my expertise and my insight of who I'm putting my money on this weekend in the college football playoffs. So you take the advice if you'd like. I'll start off with what I think is the more interesting matchup. And maybe you agree. Maybe you disagree, rather. Maybe you disagree with which you think is the more interesting matchup. But I'm going to start with Michigan and TCU. Surprisingly enough, I do think that this is the more interesting game. Even though Georgia, Ohio State is the 2 of the bigger names, is 2 of the more college football powerhouses with bigger reputations, I think that this Michigan and TCU game is going to be a whole lot closer than people expect. I think there's a little bit of recency bias about TCU. That, look, played a really tough, hard-fought game against Kansas State in the Big 12 championship. They ended up dropping that game. I think that maybe this spread of plus 7.5, TCU plus 7.5, a 7.5-point dog against Michigan in the Fiesta Bowl is kind of an overreaction to that. Because my interpretation of TCU is that they will never stop fighting. My interpretation of TCU is that they will continue to grind and they will continue to pull out the necessary stops in order to get wins, or at least to keep games close. So I look at the TCU Texas game, for example. Whenever we started to really notice TCU, because when TCU was winning 3, 4, 5 games in a row at the beginning of the season, I never really paid it any mind. And then it became a legitimate possibility that TCU could go throughout the regular season undefeated. I circled that Texas game on TCU's schedule, and I said, that's going to be your toughest test. If you can get past Texas on the road at Texas, you're winning out and you're going undefeated and you're going to the college football playoff, because TCU had Baylor, I believe, left on their schedule after that. And TCU found a way to win. All season long, TCU has found a way to stay in the fight. Now, I ultimately do think that Michigan gets the win here. I think that Michigan just has, a deeper roster top to bottom. But Michigan is without Blake Corum, their best player, their running back, who's been, the backbone of their offense all season long. So I do think that TCU is able to keep it close. One, because they're just tough. They're a tough, tough, tough team. I think that the Max Duggan effect kind of, trickles down throughout the rest of the team, because he, I think, is such a tough, tough guy who continues to fight. But I do think Michigan ultimately gets the win, but give me TCU plus 7.5. And of course, all of these odds are courtesy of BetOnline. We love our people over at BetOnline. Check it out on betonline.net. But the big one, the 1 versus 4 matchup, Georgia and Ohio State. Don't overthink this one. Don't let the reputation of Ohio State cloud your judgment of what you think that the outcome of this game is going to be. Because this Ohio State team, although CJ Stroud is going to be a top 5 pick in this year's draft, I believe, one of the top quarterbacks in the country, a Heisman Trophy finalist, I think that we all think that Ohio State should be better than they really are just because of their quarterback. And I have watched, a handful of Ohio State games. I'm no Ohio State expert, but I watched them struggle against Penn State. And I watched Ohio State in the biggest game of the season, the biggest game all year long, every single year, and the biggest game in terms of a battle test, because, you cannot play Northwestern every year and tell me that you're battle tested. No disrespect to Northwestern. I saw Ohio State host their biggest rival in the biggest game of the year in Michigan on that rivalry week game and get embarrassed on their own home turf in the biggest game of the year. They got out-toughed and outplayed by a Michigan team that didn't have their best player, their running back, Blake Corum. Georgia, on the other hand, Georgia has proven, whether it was against Tennessee, the 1 versus 3 matchup when Georgia fell to number 3 and Tennessee came into Athens as the number 1 team in the country, they proved that in big games, they'll step up. They proved that in games like that, when you're going up against a really tough opponent, that they are going to turn it on and they're going to limit whatever that team does. Nobody was able to stop Tennessee's offense until Georgia was, until Georgia limited Tennessee to a garbage time touchdown. And I think we saw it again in the SEC championship. LSU played so hard in that game. They played so tough. Georgia out-toughed them. Georgia out-toughs everyone on their schedule. I don't think that Ohio State is a very tough team because Michigan out-toughed them. The toughest test on their schedule, they got out-toughed. Georgia's a better team than Michigan. I think Georgia's going to roll. So give me Georgia minus 6.5. I think it's going to be Georgia and Michigan in the national championship. But hey, that's my take. You do whatever you want to do. But check it out on betonline.net. But that's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen today. On Monday, we're going to have a full breakdown of the Citrus Bowl. So make sure to tune into that on Monday morning, what I think LSU needs to do in order to get a win in the Citrus Bowl. But make your second listen Locked On Sports Today. Peter Bukowski brings you the biggest stories from around the sports world in 20 minutes. Get the analysis and opinions before anyone else with our local and national experts and insiders. Locked On Sports Today podcast available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. And before we go, this is our last show of the year. I just want to thank you all, whether you tune in every day, whether this is your first time tuning in. Thank you so much for spending your days with me. Thank you so much for interacting with me. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, love to do this. I love LSU. I love LSU football. I love LSU sports. And I love getting to talk to you all about the teams that we love. So thank you for making me a part of your day, of your days. And thank you for continuing to make Locked On LSU your first listen, even in 2023. I'm so incredibly grateful for all of you. It's still surreal that I get to talk about my favorite team in the world every single day. So thank you for making that a dream come true for me. Happy New Year to everyone. Have a very happy, healthy, and safe New Year. We'll see you in 2023.